We're really excited in this session to be looking at public entrepreneurs, founders of startups that have come out of the public sector, or entrepreneurs who are pioneering technology within government. What kinds of challenges are they solving? What barriers do they face? And how do we see this sort of fast emerging trend continuing over the next 2 to 5 years? To discuss these topics, I'm really excited to be joined by a fantastic panel. Lydia Yarlett, as already mentioned, a former and current doctor and now co-founder of Pando Health, a communication tool helping doctors and other public services as well communicate faster, more easily, and more safely. To be joined by Abhi Namani, one of the founding team of Code for America, former CDO for the city of Los Angeles, a civic tech lecturer at the University of Chicago, and current founder of the Public Innovation Academy. By Louise McMenemy, a Surgeon Lieutenant Commander within the Royal Navy and a recent fellow of the Percy Hobart program, supporting Navy personnel to develop entrepreneurship and innovation skills. And by Lachelle Wall-Meurens, a researcher and expert here at Public on GovTech entrepreneurs, who I believe has 2 reports coming out fairly soon on public entrepreneurship. Thank you everyone for joining us. How are you all doing?
Good.
Good, thanks.
Yeah, morning.
Excellent, good stuff. Well, Abhi, maybe to kick off with you for the first question. You were, as already mentioned, you were part of the team that founded Code for America, which in many ways was one of the first sort of training projects providing civil servants with sort of skills or developing skills to build technology and tech products. We're now starting to see these kind of programs appear all across the world, more and more of them appearing every year. And there is a definite sort of growing phenomenon of founders of companies coming out of the public sector, or this idea of entrepreneurs within the public sector creating tech products in a similar mold to entrepreneurs. We broadly or sort of clumsily call this public entrepreneurship, but how would you conceptualize this trend and maybe explain it to someone who was approaching it for the first time? And why is this important when we think about government and innovation?
Thanks, Edward. And I'm glad to be here, glad to be part of this impressive panel and talk about something really important, which is entrepreneurship in the public sector, right? The one thing that you mentioned my old company, Code for America, we like to say is that the 2 biggest levers for change in the 21st century is government and technology. So if you can bring the 2 together, the kind of impact you can have is profound. But you asked a good question, which is how do you think about this conceptually? So an interesting question is, how do people describe their relationship to government? Like, is government something we do together, or is government us versus them, right? That's the government, this is us over here. And when we started building Code for America, what we realized is there's actually more merit to that metaphor than you'd think, in that when you work inside government, you see a world around you when it comes to technology that looks entirely foreign to you or me on the outside, right? And the folks who work inside government can speak to this, that the software is antiquated, it works in a different process. It doesn't match the digital experiences we have on the outside. And on the outside, when you work with government, you see maybe a website that doesn't work that great, but you don't see anything of the massive infrastructure powering that government agency that those government folks have to deal with every day. So there's a wall. And Code for America, the first year, our tagline was, first ones through the wall. The idea being that to have a thriving, innovative ecosystem, those 2 worlds, the private sector and the public sector, can't be so strongly separated. They have to see each other, and quite literally. So that's what programs like Code for America, what I believe your Percy Fellowship does, is it gives people a chance to see each other, right? So you're a technologist from Silicon Valley or whatever you call it in London, and you don't know what's going on inside government. You don't know what problems to solve because you haven't been there. But if you go spend 6 weeks inside a government agency, you're going to get some ideas, and those ideas turn into startups. And the same thing happens on the other side. As you take a public sector employee, put them in the private sector, they start getting creative about new solutions and opportunities. And the last thing I'd say is the opportunity is massive. Right? In the US alone, just in the States, we spend $180 billion a year on technology. That's not like a market valuation of $180 billion. That's an annual spend. So when you think of the opportunity here, it's profound. And what we need more is more people seeing each other and more people talking to each other to get more things done.
Fantastic. That's a fantastic summary to kick us off with. And Lachelle, maybe to come to you, as Abhi points out, that there is this sort of need to sort of blur the boundaries a little bit between what is private sector and what is public sector. And I think we're already starting to see that happen in terms of, as previously mentioned, individuals who have worked in public services and maybe face challenges coming out of the public services to create companies that will then ultimately, serve and go back in to fix problems. This is an area, you've been studying quite a bit. I'd be really keen to understand and maybe to express to the rest of the audience, what kinds of these what kinds of people are these sort of public entrepreneurs? Where are they coming from, and what kinds of solutions are they trying to build? And what trends have you seen in the data that you've analyzed?
Yeah, so I've spent the largest part of this year talking to and interviewing public entrepreneurs, and they're mostly coming from two places. And there's important distinction between the two, which I'll explain in a bit. The first is the healthcare sector. I think over half of the public entrepreneurs in my sample are previous or current healthcare practitioners, and many of them continue to practice even after founding quite successful companies. And the reason we sort of see this predominance of healthcare practitioners turning into founders is because, there's two reasons. The first is health tech is by far the most established and mature of the GovTech sectors. So institutional investors widely recognize it as a viable industry. So there's a lot of capital and support from the private sector. But this is also matched by support from the public sector. So for instance, within the NHS, there's many innovation programs and programs specifically targeting practitioners who want to become innovators or entrepreneurs, such as like the NHS Clinical Entrepreneurs Program. And we don't really see this throughout the rest of the public sector. So the second group is defense. And what's interesting about defense, and this sort of speaks to the kinds of solutions and problems these entrepreneurs are addressing. So in defense, about 86% of public entrepreneurs coming out of the Ministry of Defense go on to build tech startups in sectors unrelated to defense. So they're not actively trying to solve the problems they faced operationally in their day-to-day job, whereas this was the case for healthcare practitioners who mostly take their experience on the front line and then turn that into a healthcare startup. So those are sort of like the two origins we see in terms of public sector entrepreneurship.
Fantastic. And in some ways, our panel demonstrates that quite nicely between Lydia and Louise. Lydia, to come to you, you are a clinician and a doctor, and you've also now founded a company, or say a number of years ago, you founded Pando. It would be really useful to get your view on, what were the kind of key challenges that you face in terms of making that transition between public sector to founder, and where do you think it has benefited Pando in some ways to have that experience that you've got from within inside public services?
Yeah, sure. So I think I would have to echo what Abby said about there being a wall that we need to work on breaking down. But I'd say that also exists as a mindset difference. So moving from a very, very regimented system where there's a great deal of emphasis on hierarchy, risk-taking and experiments are generally discouraged. And obviously that's particular to healthcare, but significant across most public services. It's actually quite difficult personally to enter that realm of, okay, well, the more mistakes we make, the better, as long as we're learning from them. So I think that was a personal challenge for me. I'd absolutely agree that there needs to be more mixing and an opportunity for people to have portfolio careers. And I feel very privileged to still continue in my role as a practicing clinician and still remain in my role as a co-founder of Pando Health.
There's almost a sort of flip side of the coin here, which is there are entrepreneurs or sort of who we think of as innovators in some ways, as founders who create companies, raise investment from VCs, and take their startup, in a sort of Facebook-like trajectory, But there's another side here, which is entrepreneurs, and it's individuals who work within the system, who maybe receive funding or support or resources from the departments that they work within. I was wondering if you could just reflect from your experiences, either through the Percy Hobart program or more widely, as to what do you think both the advantages of that route might be, but also some areas where, you have to be mindful if you're thinking of becoming an entrepreneur?
Yeah, thanks very much, Ed. So I represent the joining of Lascelles two groups because I work in defence and I'm a doctor. So as a military doctor, I can definitely attest to what Lascelles was talking about. I think what we highlight here is the consistent theme that's already been discussed by the other panel members, that everyone's talked about individuals who understand the areas they work in and develop technology to help in that area. They know the area best and can sympathise and empathise with the problem and are able to provide solutions to improve working environment for their colleagues. And so that's one of the advantages of being an entrepreneur. You really understand the problem you're trying to solve and understand the pain points within the large organisation that you work in. And you also have an organisation around you to support you with the development of the idea and potentially access to investment to progress the idea, with a lot of the personal risk associated with startup culture already removed. I mean, there are clearly disadvantages of being an entrepreneur working in a large organisation, all of the red tape and the slow-moving system. But organisations like the Royal Navy that I work for are really relishing the challenge of developing mechanisms to try and bypass the institutional systems to enable transformation at pace. And I think transformation has to be driven by those working within the organisation. Individuals have good ideas to come up with within the areas that they work in to try and increase efficiency and to try and have ideas that improve the economy they're working within. So an example of this within the Royal Navy is the development of the My Navy app. It's a relatively new product for us, and it puts information about the service person's employment in the organisation, in the Royal Navy, onto your own phone. Now, I know that doesn't sound particularly revolutionary, but for an organisation that requires so many layers of security, this really is a breakthrough for us. Service personnel direct access on their phones, the details about pay, their career, expenses, and increasingly their health, which is the area that I'm working within. And it really empowers the service personnel, and it's spearheaded by service personnel, which is the really important part of it. They know the areas which are priority, and they understand the experience for people. And this model allows people to drive and lead forward innovation ideas, ensuring that the military personnel are at the centre of that. So training is required, which is what the Percy Hobart Fellowship empowered me with. And then you clearly need to ensure that people are employed within those areas once they've been given those requisite skills. If you don't employ them in those areas, they will leave, and you won't have those entrepreneurs within organisations. But the Royal Navy are really leading the way within the MOD with things like the Percy Hobart Fellowship and other examples of that.
I think Louise has almost, preempted the question which I was going to ask, which is to open up to the rest of the group. If you had recommendations, or you asked to give recommendations to a department or maybe even a government as to, on the one side, how do you sort of foster the sort of ground level of entrepreneurship or intrapreneurship? And then Lydia, to return to your question of actually, once you've done that, how do you scale it? How do you make sure this transformation sticks, actually grows? What would be the sort of first few bullet points of recommendations you might give? Abby, maybe to come to you first.
So the funny thing is, I've actually written that up, so I'm happy to just send that. Well, for American cities, I should say, not for the Royal Navy. But it's a really good question. Because what happens is, and this is it's interesting about working in the public sector, I'm curious if my other panelists agree, is that you think government's this one big thing, but in fact it's a lot of little things that all connect together, sometimes well, sometimes not. But what that ends up meaning is that when you do something well, you figure out, say, how to hire good technical talent. That's a big challenge, right? That's something a lot of other agencies can use. And so what I've seen myself in my career is that kind of waterfall effect, where a city will build a digital services group, for instance, right, to build something like the My Navy app, which sounds wonderful, by the way. I mean, putting together data just in one city is hard. For the whole Navy, that's amazing. So the one hand, you get these skills, help share those with people. And so that way, what the best practices become more standardized, and then you can start seeing how different agencies are doing at that. Did that make sense? Sorry.
Lascelles, maybe to come to you and to move the topic of conversation to one of skills here. Programs like the Clinical Entrepreneurs Program within the NHS and some of the programs that the public has run look at trying to provide public sector workers with the skills to start building technology and building companies. If you were to sort of try and pick out almost the constituent parts here of how what are the things you need to add to the repertoire of a doctor or a police officer or even a local councillor to turn them into a entrepreneur or a founder. What are the key skills that we're talking about here?
Yeah, so this is actually a question I put to many of the founders I interviewed. Like, in hindsight, what do you think was the most important thing you had to learn on your entrepreneurial journey? And then there is the set of hard skills, which is you need some basic finance capabilities. You need to do your accounting to keep the business running, and then tech skills to build a tech product. But in most cases, it's better for them to partner with someone. So individually, I would kind of want to re-emphasize the point Lydia made early on, is that it's really a mindset change that has to happen. They have to get used to being their own boss, setting their own course of action, not working in a highly structured, risk-averse environment is the first. And the second is, and this is more applicable to entrepreneurs and intrapreneurs, is they have to learn to differentiate between a good idea that solves a problem and a commercially viable idea. And sometimes those are the same thing, and then you have a great business, but that's not always the case. And that's often a big stumbling block for many public sector entrepreneurs.
As we head into the last 5 minutes, I'd like to sort of cast forward with these last few questions. As we mentioned at the beginning, this is a sort of emerging trend of individuals who are either creating companies having left public services or creating companies as entrepreneurs within public services. And I think we're almost starting to see the kind of two terms of what it means to be a public sector worker and what it means to be a founder starting to get blurred as we see more entrepreneurships in residence within departments, or even individuals who are being seconded out of government to create companies. I kind of want to ask, as we cast forward sort of 2-5 years, as most of us think this trend is going to continue, what do we think this landscape will look like? What is the journey we're heading on, and where do we think this kind of piloting of innovation for public services will start to head? Does anyone have any thoughts and want to jump in?
Yeah, I think that we'll see that user-driven innovative ideas will become more commonplace. I think for something like defence, with the announcement yesterday that we're going to have 4 years worth of funding, that will really help us to make decisions on what we're willing to take risks on and not willing to take risks on. If you only have 1 year of funding, you're very risk averse because you're worried about that pot running out within that year. If you can forecast out to 4 years, that's really going to help us. So I think user-driven tech will become more and more commonplace. Organisations will work symbiotically, or they will manage to maintain our own individual identities. Like Abby was talking about, there's going to be the need to be able to discuss between different identities within organisations. I think that will become more and more common as we move forward.
Fantastic. Does anyone else have any thoughts here of what we can expect over the next 2 to 5 years?
Yeah, I'll just jump in and say on two sides of it. So I think one, if we're effective, we'll start to see meaningful new growth of talent within public sector entities, right? Either measured by current employees developing new skills or new people getting recruited there. And I think that's going to be really excited to see. But on the flip side, again, I come from a small town in the Midwest in America. We can't hire a chief data officer here. And so how are cities like that going to get access to the kind of innovation that you guys are doing at Public or through the fellowship or in your different organizations? Well, it's going to be through new businesses, as we just discussed, viable businesses that can scale. But one thing I'll just flag and then stop talking is I think what's going to happen in the next 2 to 4 years is we're going to find a new set of investors for these kinds of companies that are non-traditional VC, because we're not in public sector, probably not going to have the same kind of returns that you'll see in other spaces. This isn't Facebook, but you'll see good, solid returns. And I think what we're going to see, which is going to be great, is people who've been successful, like some of the folks on this panel, who've been successful in their public entrepreneurship, start to give back and fund other entrepreneurs at a different type of pace than venture capital typically expects. And once we get there, my friend, I think we'll be in a really exciting spot.